This
Fiduciary
conference
duties
will now
of,
be recorded.
Sorry.
we're going to talk about the fiduciary duties of nonprofit board members. And let's distinguish between nonprofit boards and for-profit boards, because there are different reasons you might join a for-profit board. So a for-profit board might be Procter and Gamble or General Motors or any corporation that's objective is a profit for its shareholders. There are people, the shareholders of any corporation that's for profit, that derive some form of income from the corporation. But obviously, with a nonprofit, as I call us stakeholders in nonprofits, we're not going to derive a profit. Instead, we have other motivations for joining a nonprofit board. Laura, if you don't mind advancing it one. So really, I want to focus on first, why do we join a volunteer or a nonprofit board? And there's a lot of reasons you might seek to be involved in a nonprofit board. It may be that the mission of that nonprofit is important to you, whether it is, the Cancer Society or the Heart Association or SICSA or some other organization that does work that is meaningful to you. You may also have a history with that organization, and we could use CISV as an example. Many of you may have had experience with CISV as a youngster, as I did, as many of us did. And so the mission and the work of that organization is important to us. It may be that you or your family members, your children, grandchildren may be involved in the organization. That could be, for instance, a youth baseball or soccer organization that does not seek a profit in its work. It might raise money for the work of the organization, but it does not seek to make a profit for its members. All right. And then finally, you may join a nonprofit or a volunteer board for some personal or professional growth. So it may be an organization that's associated with your profession, and you are volunteering your time such that it may, again, enhance your resume, your professional networking, etc. So there's a lot of reasons that we may join a nonprofit board. And those reasons, at least from my perspective, are always good reasons in that we want to help do the work of that organization. And especially with volunteer organizations or nonprofits, a lot of the work may be done by the board. So you may not even have compensated employees that are doing some of the work of the organization. And so a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times the heavy lifting is done by the volunteer board. And there is this sort of mixing of roles of sort of a quasi-employee versus a board member who's a decision maker. All right. And so we're going to try tonight to make certain that we keep very clearly defined lines between a board member and their obligations to the organization, and then perhaps an employee who has entirely different obligations. If we could advance one then, Laura. So if you don't mind advancing one slide, Laura. Thank you. So let's define what a fiduciary is. And fiduciary is, that relationship arises in many different contexts. It is really any relationship where you are acting on behalf of someone else, as opposed to acting on your own behalf. A fiduciary could be, for instance, a guardian, someone who is acting on behalf of either an incompetent or a person or a child. A fiduciary could be an executor of an estate, where again, you are handling the affairs of an individual who is deceased and therefore obviously cannot not act on his or her behalf. A fiduciary is also someone who acts on behalf of a corporation or any other business entity. So by necessity, a fiduciary is one who does not act on their own behalf, but instead acts on behalf of someone else. And the most basic obligation of any fiduciary is to do what is best for your the person you're acting on behalf of, and not on your own behalf. And sometimes those roles can get a little muddled, but certainly in the nonprofit context, we can clearly separate what is best for us personally and what is best for the nonprofit. So our focus as a fiduciary must always be on what's in the best interest of that nonprofit. All right. I teach this to law students, and I often describe, it's okay, Laura, you can go ahead. I often describe it as wearing a hat. Once you put on that hat where you're a fiduciary, you can only wear one hat, and you cannot act on your own behalf. You can't wear your own hat at the same time as you wear your fiduciary hat. So you must only act on behalf of the nonprofit. Now, fiduciary duties, they take on different meanings depending on the context. So if, for instance, we were talking about the fiduciary duties of a partner or of a board member in a for-profit corporation, our discussion would be much different than it is tonight. We're focusing on the role of the nonprofit, a board member in a nonprofit organization. Again, if we were talking about for-profit entities, our conversation would be very different. All right. So if you have any prior history or knowledge with for-profit boards, their role is quite different from that of a fiduciary on a nonprofit board. The basic fiduciary duties of any fiduciary in a nonprofit context are what are known as the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. The duty of obedience is has a little bit different context, and I don't want to get into the law of it because that'll confuse you even more, but let's just say our primary focus will be the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. Okay, so Laura, if we could advance one, and we'll talk about the duty of care. And the duty of care might seem to be a misnomer because it sounds like we have to be careful in our actions. And I've heard people before say, well, they always thought the duty of care meant they were not to be negligent. When in fact, the duty of care in the fiduciary context relates to the decision-making process. And the theory is that if you are careful in the way you make your decisions, then you will have fulfilled your duty of care. And the reason behind that is that none of us have 20/20 vision. None of us know what's going to happen in the future, and if a decision is going to be what we might call a good one. And so it would be really easy to say that as let me just give you an example. As board members of CISV organizations, you decided to go, trying to think of a place, to Honduras, all right? And you decided that was a good place to have a program, obviously in a non-COVID year. And Honduras is not a safe place to travel. It's on the State Department's sort of list of countries that U.S. citizens should not travel to. It has got a very high rate of violence in Honduras. But let's assume your organization decided that's where you wanted to engage in a program. The fact that some event may have happened, let's say your participants were robbed while they were in Honduras, all right? That's a bad event. But could you necessarily have foreseen that, all right? And so as board members, you are not expected to be able to see into the future that while we thought we had a safe trip planned to Honduras, we never anticipated a robbery. If it was the standard that all of your decisions had to end up being what we might call good ones, why would you ever want to be on a board? Because we simply cannot anticipate everything that's going to happen. So instead, the duty of care goes to your decision-making process. Did you have a good process for your decision? Not that you made a good decision, but that you had a good process for your decision. All right. Maybe your organization decided that Honduras was a good place to have a program or to participate in a program because you were provided information about safety measures, etc. You know, example I will use is my youngest brother told me the other day that he was going to Honduras. And I said, oh my gosh, you can't go there. It is dangerous. It's on the State Department's watch list. It's on their list of countries to which U.S. citizens should travel.
Kate, we're stuck just a minute.
And he said, well, I'm actually going from
Kate. Hey, Kate.
And so,
Kate. Hi, Kate. Can you start the story from the beginning of when your brother made the decision?
Okay, hold on a second.
Yeah, having just a little bit of internet trouble. So if you can start again from the top of your brother's decision to go to Honduras.
Okay. He made a personal decision. My only point is sometimes going to Honduras might not be a bad idea. You might be going from Miami to a private island and, you know, you wouldn't have the safety concerns. Okay. So his decision might have ended up being a good one. But again, if you as a nonprofit board member make a decision that ends up being a bad one, do you want to be liable or responsible for that decision? And the duty of care tells us that as long as you had a good process in making your decision, we're not going to fault you for going to Honduras or going to a private island or whatever it might be, as long as you focused on two things in your decision making. You were what's called you were informed and you were deliberative. That means that you got the information that a reasonable person would want under the same or similar circumstances, and you deliberated in a manner that a reasonable person would under the same or similar circumstances. We must have both. We can't have information without appropriate deliberation. We can't have deliberation without appropriate information. Laura, if you don't mind advancing one. So as I mentioned, the duty of care requires the fiduciaries, typically the board of directors, to use the same care that they would if it was a reasonable person under the same or similar circumstances. So let me give you an example, and let's kind of stick with that Honduras example. This is no criticism of Honduras. I understand it's a beautiful country, wonderful people. There are just some security concerns presently there. So let's assume your CISV organization was provided with information from the hosts that the program was being held on a private island, that no one involved in the program would be on the mainland where, you know, the concerns about violence are present, that there is adequate security, that no one else could get on the island other than the participants and the adults and the staff and anyone supplying any necessary provisions. And once you were satisfied that you had sufficient information, and then as a board, you deliberated. What is deliberation? deliberation is talking, listening. It may be talking to experts. So maybe you would discuss with a security expert whether this private island would be safe. Perhaps you would consult with someone from the State Department who might talk with you about, well, the travel arrangements to this private island are considered to be safe, etc. So once we have all of the information, we must deliberate in an appropriate manner. And let me give you an example that I often use about deliberation. Let's assume we're trying to decide where we are going to go to dinner tonight, all right? And there are 3 of us that are going to dinner. And we talk about how much money we want to spend, if any of us have any dietary or other limitations on what we either want to or can eat. We talk about how far or how much time we have to have dinner or travel to dinner. That's probably all the information necessary for us to make our decision. It would be reasonable to have that information. Maybe we would want to know how much each one of us wants to spend, but other than that, we probably don't need a lot more information. And then how much time is necessary to deliberate? We could probably deliberate on where we're going to go to dinner for 10 hours, or we could deliberate for 1 minute. But the key to whether we have appropriately deliberated is what would a reasonable person do under the same or similar circumstances. And so we have to ask ourselves is what is a reasonable person? And a reasonable person isn't you and it isn't me. A reasonable person is really a fictitious person, the person who is sort of ordinary, all right? Not, if we looked at it in political extremes, it's not the guy to the left or the guy to the right, but it's kind of the guy in the middle that is just, it's just ordinary. And that's the amount not only of information you must have, but the deliberation you must undertake. And, I've used this example as we go to dinner and we don't really need a lot of information and we likely don't need to deliberate very long. But let's say we've decided, again, that we're going to send a group of 11-year-olds to a camp. Now, again, let's consider this in a non-COVID world because we would have a lot more to consider. So in an ordinary time, what would we consider? Do we have an adult that can go? How much money is it going to cost? Is the camp adequately staffed? Do they have appropriate training? Do we have 11-year-olds that we want to send in the sense that they're prepared and they're appropriate to send? There are also a lot of additional things that you would want to consider, but those are just some of the highlights. And then how long would you deliberate? That's probably not a decision that you would make even in one board meeting. It may be several board meetings. You may decide that you want to consult with an expert. So you may want to call Laura and find out what her experience or what information she has about whether it is the hosts or the camp director. You may want to contact a risk manager, whether it's the U.S. risk manager or someone in the host country, to get more information. And so the amount of information and the length of deliberation or the extent of deliberation is always circumstantial. Under the circumstances, what would a reasonable person do in terms of how they would deliberate and how much information they would want? We're going to go to dinner, probably less information and less deliberation. We're going to send 4 11-year-olds out of the country, a lot more information, including probably, again, experts, and a lot longer deliberation. And so, if you as an organization are trying to decide if you're going to buy a computer for your chapter, there's probably not a lot of information you need other than what are the needs of your organization, who's going to use it, What capabilities do we need? How much do we want to spend? That is a decision, again, circumstantially, that may not require a great deal of information and may not require a great deal of deliberation. And so we can't compare every decision. Instead, it's the decision we're going to make. What would a reasonable person want to know? And how would a reasonable person deliberate? I will tell you that it is always better to have longer and more extensive deliberations. It's always better to have more information, but that doesn't mean that you have to get all of the information that you could, because that's quite frankly impossible. We would never, none of us would ever make decisions if we just got every piece of information that we possibly could. And so, in summarizing the duty of care, remember, it's what would a reasonable person want to know under these circumstances, and how would a reasonable person deliberate under these circumstances? As long as you as board members satisfy those two requirements, information and deliberation, your decision will never be questioned. Remember, hindsight's 2020. We would never look at whether your decision was a good one or a bad one. You know, I've told people this story before. I went on
Kate, you cut out just a little bit again.
a CISD program. It was a coup while I was there. All right. Nobody anticipated that. If we look hindsight, that was a bad decision to send this group on an interchange to Guatemala. Well, again, the board that had that information, or excuse me, that decided to send our group to Guatemala could not have anticipated that there would be a coup while we were there. Okay, we're never going to look at the decision that, there was a coup while these kids were there. We're going to look at the information that they had when they made the decision, and did they have the information a reasonable person should have, and how did they deliberate? Okay, Laura, if you could advance one slide, please. Some aspects of the duty of care that go into decision making, so information and deliberation, include things like, did you look at the books and records, the financial books and records of the nonprofit? So as opposed to listening to what your treasurer says, you know, your treasurer says, we have X number of dollars in our bank account, we got all the money we need. Well, as board members, you should be looking at the actual records. Have you seen bank statements? Have you seen audits, etc.? And so information in that sense is not just what your treasurer says. It might also be documentation, okay? The duty of care also requires that you regularly attend and participate in meetings. Now, that doesn't mean missing a meeting will mean you violated your duty of care, or not responding in a meeting or not saying anything will mean that you violated your duty of care. Instead, attendance and participation really go to whether you had information, you knew what was going on, and then you participated in the decision-making process. In addition, to satisfy the duty of care, your board must always be looking at your policies and procedures. Now, that doesn't mean at every meeting you go through every policy and procedure to determine if it's appropriate or if it needs changing. But it does mean that as a board, you regularly, it might be once a year, it might be once every 2 or 3 years, you review your policies and procedures to ensure that you have all of the information that you may need, and then that you're making decisions consistent with that. An example might be if your CISV chapter is in a state where there is a new state law that involves overnight camps. If your policies and procedures conflict with that state law, then you may not be meeting your fiduciary duties. So we always, every organization should undergo a routine review of their procedures to determine if they are in compliance with, again, whether it's state law, federal law. It might be the rules and regulations of CISV USA. It might be the rules and regulations of the International Board. So this is always an appropriate endeavor. I'm on another board where we have a policy where every 5 years we review every rule of this organization, and it's entirely different from CISV. But nonetheless, every 5 years, even if there hasn't been a change in things, we still review the policies and procedures, and we don't do it at one meeting. We do it at a series of extra meetings, again, to give it the appropriate attention. I also mentioned that in fulfilling your duty of care, you may need to consult experts. So I mentioned that maybe you need to contact Laura to find out information from her or from a risk manager, or consult with the State Department, again, on travel precautions. You might want to contact, if you're hosting a program, you may want to contact your insurance agent or some other expert to make certain that you have all of the information that you need in your decision-making process. Finally, with regard to the duty of care, again, we want to make certain that while you are looking at everything, reviewing everything, you are also monitoring your executive director. Now, whether your chapter has an executive director or not, many nonprofits do have someone who I'm going to say is sort of steering the ship. All right. And the board cannot relinquish its obligations to an executive director, even though the executive director likely is responsible for the day-to-day activity of the organization, because the board of directors has the ultimate decision-making authority, and particularly in terms of policies and procedures. The board must exercise those responsibilities and cannot cede them or turn them over to an executive director. Okay, we're going to make certain that we, I'm going to say, respect the different roles. Executive director, day-to-day operations. Board of directors or board of trustees, however your organization defines that group of fiduciaries, is in charge of policies and procedures, but not typically carrying out the policy and procedures. Now, Laura, if we could advance one more and talk about your meeting minutes, excuse me, from your board or organizational meetings. Why are meeting minutes important? Well, obviously they're important historically because they will remind us maybe what we talked about, what was decided, etc. But the minutes of your meeting are very important to any claim that the board did not meet its duty of care. And so if you have minutes that reflect the topics that you discussed and how you voted, then that goes a long way in documenting your satisfaction of your duty of care. I suspect all of you, like myself, have been to a million different board meetings for a million different organizations. And you probably kind of remember things that you talked about and kind of remembered how long the meeting was. But without minutes for your meeting, you may not have a very specific recollection of what occurred. And so keeping minutes at every meeting may very well be your proof that you complied with primarily the duty of care. So let's just talk about some of the things that those meetings should reflect. They first of all should reflect the beginning and ending time of the meeting. The meeting started at 7 p.m. The meeting closed at 9 p.m. Why is that important? Because we talked about deliberation, and deliberation has a time component. Because again, we're going to go to dinner. We may deliberate for a minute. We're going to send a group of kids to Honduras. We may deliberate over the course of 6 hours over 3 meetings. And so, depending on the circumstances, the length of the deliberation can go to whether you've satisfied the duty of care. Now, a couple other things about meeting minutes that are important. The motions, excuse me, motions should be specifically stated. What was the motion? All right, so I move that we send a delegation of 11-year-olds to Argentina. All right. In what year? Is it 2022? Is it December of 2023? So we need some specificity to our motion. But once that motion has been made and seconded, and again, depending on the rules of your organization, I'm typically referring to Robert's Rules of Order, so which would require a motion and a second. Thereafter, any specific discussion should not be included in your minutes. Now, you may include, we heard from Laura about experiences in Argentina. We contacted the State Department and received this information. But what board members individually say should never be included in your minutes. You should include that a discussion was had and likely what information was had. It's very important that if there's material supplied to the board at a meeting, that copies of those are attached to your minutes, because once again, they show the information that you had in fulfilling your duty of care. Your votes should be included in the minutes. And you don't have to say Joe voted yes and Mary voted no, but instead it should reflect that the vote was 7-2 in favor of sending the delegation to Argentina. Again, that's just by way of example. But if anyone abstained, you should indicate that person specifically, because actually, Laura, you can advance it because it's a great segue into the next topic. Because abstentions often can go to the duty of loyalty. And let's talk about the duty of loyalty. The duty of loyalty requires that as board members, you place the interests of the organization above your personal interests, that you avoid conflicts of interest. We'll talk about what these are, and that you avoid using your board service as any means of personal or familial gain. Now, let's talk about that last bullet point first. What do we mean by personal or familial gain? Let's assume that you're on the board of a CISV chapter, and the chapter is looking for someone to be the leader of this delegation to Argentina. All right. It's okay that you be the leader and that you're on the board, as long as you don't participate in the vote or you don't attempt to influence the rest of the board to send you with that delegation, because that would be using your board service for personal gain. If you sit back and say, I'll go, but I'm going to leave the room while the rest of you talk about it, you will not have violated your duty of loyalty. All right. So as long as you don't attempt use your position, i.e., vote in favor of yourself going, or try to, I would say, encourage is probably not a strong enough word, but attempt to get the others to vote in favor of you going, you will have satisfied your duty of loyalty. But let me give you a couple of other examples of using board service for personal or familial gain. And I have encountered these experiences not with regard to any CISV organization, but instead with regard to other nonprofit organizations. Let's assume that a nonprofit organization wants to hold a fundraising event, and a board member says, why don't you rent my facility for the fundraising event, and you can pay me $5,000 to rent my facility. That board member would be personally gaining from their board service. And so it is extremely important to never suggest, imply, offer your personal services unless you're willing to do it for free, or attempt to offer the services of a family member or someone close to you to the nonprofit board that you're on. It is very common for people on nonprofit boards to say, I've got a friend, I've got a family member, they can do that, but you're going to have to pay them. That actually is in violation of your fiduciary duties, particularly if you participate in any vote in favor of that transaction, or you attempt to encourage other board members to vote in favor of that transaction. All right. Now let's go back to the first bullet point, and that is, remember I said earlier about we can only wear one hat. And when you are a fiduciary, your duty of loyalty is to the nonprofit and not to yourself. So you're wearing that hat that says, I am always going to do what's in the best interest of the nonprofit and not myself. All right. Now let's talk about avoiding conflicts of interest. And we've really talked about this a little bit, but Laura, if you want to advance one more. A conflict of interest occurs when a fiduciary, or in our context, a board member, whether it's through their vote or their attempt to influence the votes of others, they confer a benefit either on themselves or someone close to them. So, I've given you the examples, maybe a board member votes to give a contract to his or his wife, or a board member votes for her spouse to be the leader of a delegation. Is she wearing her hat? I am interested in my husband going, I am interested in this contract for my wife. Or am I doing what's best for the nonprofit? Remember, we can only wear one hat at a time. All right. Laura, if we could go forward. And each year, your board should require each board member to complete a conflict of interest statement. Actually, the IRS will require this of you if you have a nonprofit status, and all CISV organizations should have a nonprofit status. And so I'm sure Laura can provide you with a copy of a statement that your board members should complete every year. But essentially, that a conflict of interest statement will reveal to the rest of the board if you have any conflicts of interest with your chapter or the nonprofit on which you serve. Let me give you an example. Let's assume that you have a board member who owns a local facility where you hold your 11-year-old village experiences when you host them. All right. And that board member charges your chapter a reasonable rate for the rental. That board member must reveal that conflict of interest in their annual conflict of interest statement. Because again, that board member could be violating their fiduciary duties if they encourage the rest of the board or they vote in favor of giving this contract to themselves. But you as board members can say, look, this is the only facility in our locale that is appropriate to host a village. And this board member gives us a reasonable rate. We've investigated the rent. It's reasonable. As long as you, though, as board members, know about this conflict of interest with the other board member, then you can fulfill your duty of care, okay? All of these records must be maintained in your, what are known as your corporate records, so your nonprofit records. So your meeting minutes that we talked about that will help satisfy your duty of care must be maintained. Your annual conflict of interest statements must be maintained. So, another concern is how do you keep your records? I was on a board once where it was a soccer organization. We couldn't find the old records. They were in somebody's house, but she died. And then we couldn't get access to them. And thereafter, we developed a system of keeping those records in a centralized location so that everybody could have access to them no matter what happened, no matter whether a board member died, left, didn't get reelected to the board, whatever it might have been. And so maintaining your records and not relying upon the fact that you have volunteers who are helping you is really important. And again, let me use the example of CISV USA, okay? The records of CISV are not in somebody's basement somewhere. They are maintained in, I don't want to call it a database, but in a platform that any future board would be able to have access to those documents and records. That is often difficult. Let's say you have, ASV chapter. Where you don't have a lot of money to spend on record maintenance, but it is important for transmitted, to new boards or new board members. All right, so record keeping is extremely important. I think we've lost. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, you were just out
I'm going
for
to
a
assume
second.
that you can. Okay.
Yeah, you were just out for a second,
Okay.
Kate.
So I'll just repeat what I had said, which is
Well,
record keeping is
can I,
extremely important, but
yeah,
also having a system of transferring those records when, as the board transitions to new members. Laura, do you mind advancing one more slide? And we'll talk about board composition, and particularly for a nonprofit. This is really, it is an issue with for-profit boards, but it is a significant issue with nonprofit boards. And that is the composition of your board. Oftentimes with nonprofits, we take anybody who wants to volunteer. I'm sure you all have been involved with nonprofits where you are out looking for board members. You needed bodies, people who were willing to help. And you couldn't always get the perfect board member. And by that, I mean somebody who brings a particular skill set that you need for your board. It may be just, we just need people. That is not unusual with nonprofits or volunteer boards. But even though we kind of might be tempted to sort of take anybody who wants to help, in fulfilling your duty of loyalty and your duty of care, existing board members actually must take some steps to vet, or we could use the word investigate, potential board members. All right. Your board should also have a procedure for identifying or electing new board members. All right. And it may be, I have used an example of a special committee, or with CISV USA, there's a governance committee that fulfills this responsibility, but that is not required. Instead, you must have a process whereby each candidate for your board is reviewed, vetted, and that vetting may be looking at things like criminal record, history of board service in the past. It might sound like it's invasive and that you are not willing to embrace new members, but when in fact it is necessary to fulfill your fiduciary duties to make certain that the people coming on the board that will be making decisions about that organization can fulfill their duties. All right. Laura, do you mind going back one to the duty of obedience?
Whoa.
So if you could go back 2 slides.
Hold on. I don't know what's going on now.
That's okay. While Laura's doing that, I'm going to talk about the duty of obedience. And I know that sounds like a, yeah, just back 1, Laura, please.
Well, it doesn't seem to want to go back for me.
That's okay. That's okay. I'll just talk about it.
Here we go.
There you go. Thank you. The duty of obedience really is obedience not to any person. It's obedience to the rules, bylaws, regulations, whatever you might call them, for the organization. So you are complying with the organizational or governing documents of that organization. So, for instance, with your fee chapter, if you have bylaws, a charter, whatever term that you are using for your governing documents, you as board members must comply with those documents. You must, whether it's the election of officers, whether it is the financial regulations, whether it is membership, those are just some examples. You must comply with those requirements. I'm on a nonprofit board where we all forgot how often we had to elect a new president. We just let the same person be president forever because nobody else wanted to do it. And one day the president read the bylaws and said, "We've been in violation of the bylaws for 5 years. This guy said, I've been president and you guys never elected me after the first term." We were not obeying our governing documents. So again, we were in violation of our fiduciary duties, which is kind of a sad thing because it was an organization of all lawyers. So not really a good idea. In addition, you must obey the mission of the organization. What do your governing documents say about your mission? And if we use CISV as an example, there's a very specific mission statement about CISV. CISV's mission statement is not, for instance, global climate change. Yes, are people involved in CISV? Is that a concern? Yes, but that is not the specific mission of CISV. All right, so we must adhere to what is the organization about And are our decisions meeting that mission? We also must comply with all laws, state, federal, local, if there are any that apply, including any tax laws. So I mentioned that the IRS regulations require a conflict of interest statement for all nonprofit boards. So your board is required to obey that law. Sometimes it's difficult to know all of the laws and regulations that will affect your nonprofit. And that's why it is important to either have legal counsel that is advising you, or hopefully you will have a lawyer that is volunteering their service on your board to assist you. But you can also seek the assistance of experts. As I mentioned, you might contact Laura and ask her if there are any laws or regulations that she's aware of that you need to be in compliance with. All right. This duty of obedience, implicit in that is that you have read the governing documents of the organization, that you have kept abreast of those governing documents. I mentioned to you that I'm on a nonprofit board of all lawyers. We hadn't read our governing documents. The organization was moving along quite well, but we had not bothered to continue to familiarize ourselves with our own governing documents. Okay. Oftentimes, these governing documents, the laws applicable to your organization, whether state, local, or federal, and the tax laws can implicate whether your organization will or can even maintain their nonprofit status. So in addition to fulfilling your obligation to the organization, you may have considerable need to make certain that you're in compliance so that you do not jeopardize the nonprofit status of your organization. So let's move on to a final slide to summarize how you fulfill your fiduciary duties. The very first and maybe the most important thing to do in fulfilling your fiduciary duties: be knowledgeable about whatever laws, regulations apply to your organization. And a corollary to that is to not only know your governing documents, but also routinely review those governing documents as well as your policies and procedures to determine if there is any need for any update, whether it's to comply with new laws, whether it's to comply with any change in your organization's structure. For instance, CISV USA underwent a few years ago, I think it was about 6 years ago, a significant change in its governing documents, particularly relating to board structure. Went from a very large board to a much more manageable size board. Well, if you were involved in CISV at the time and you had not read the governing documents, you may not realize, again, how elections take place, how many people are on the board, how long their term is, etc. Additionally, and in fulfilling your duty of loyalty, you must annually not only explore, but also identify any conflicts of interest. You should periodically engage in board training and development. So developing new board members, but also training those board members. So for instance, tonight, this fiduciary duty conversation would be training. And you can take this back to your board and talk with your board members about what fiduciary duties are, why you need minutes, how you gather information, etc. All right. But you should be engaging in ongoing training on a variety of topics, whether it's safety, risk management, travel, a whole host of items. And so as board members, that's part of your obligation, is to identify areas where training is necessary and engage in that training, whether it's the board or your members. As a final issue, ask questions, identify experts. We as board members volunteer our time because the organization, again, is important to us, its mission, or to our families, but we don't know everything. And while we try in many nonprofit organizations to develop a sort of a list or a group of people who can fulfill a lot of different functions on the board, maybe legal, maybe medical, maybe event planning, maybe finance, etc. While we try to do that, we are probably never, any board, going to be able to know all the areas of expertise that we would need in making our decisions. And so consult with experts. Again, whether it's Laura, whether it's risk management, whether it's somebody in your community, but don't be afraid to ask questions, because that may be what's necessary to fulfill primarily your duty of care in those circumstances. My final statement is to remember the difference between the board and the executive director. And my last bullet point is stay in your lane. And by that I mean, let the executive director do his or her work, the day-to-day operations. As board members, your duty is to set policies and make decisions, but not infringe upon the executive director's role. It is too common where board members start attempting to direct staff, get involved in decisions that are those left to the executive director. And that can actually cause you as board members to have some liability for infringing upon the executive director's role. So just remember, the board stays in its lane and let the executive director stay in his or her lane. So that's the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I know that Laura had this scheduled for an hour, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I have one question. You're saying that don't infringe on the role of the executive director. Aren't we, I'm like a chapter president, so I assume that I'm just the president of the board, and that
Correct.
that Laura is the executive director of the whole organization, right?
Well, Laura is the executive director of CISV USA. But if you are a chapter president and you do not have an executive director, then likely your board is functioning in such a way that your board members are taking on the role that an executive director would, that you have divided up the duties. All right. So CISV USA, we have an executive director in Laura. She runs the day-to-day operations. But I suspect that most, if not all, chapters do not have an executive director, that your board is running your day-to-day operations. And that's fine as long as you don't have an executive director. All right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have questions? Laura, I'm not seeing any other.
I'm not either. I really appreciate you doing this, Kate. Thank you very much for joining us and taking the time to share your knowledge with us. I'm sure this is really helpful. And for everybody who didn't see it, I sent this PowerPoint and the link to the recording out tomorrow.
All right. But I am happy to answer by email any questions if you have any, and Laura can get you my email address. Okay.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. Okay. I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thanks.
This conference will now be recorded.